Not lying, my conscience confirms it in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption as sons. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving from the law, the temple worship and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of Christ, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen. I can't begin to describe to you the entire journey. You'll have to look into it yourself, but there has never been a boat journey quite like the one Ernest Shackleton made on board the James Caird. Now, I said boat journey, not ship. The James Caird may sound like the name of a big ship, but believe me, it wasn't. It was a little lifeboat, rigged with a homemade mast and sail, and that's all they had. Shackleton's real ship, the Endurance, had already been completely destroyed, crushed into splinters by the expanding ice of the frozen seas of the Antarctic. And when that happened, Shackleton and 5 other men set out in that little lifeboat and sailed for 16 days through icy seas and unbelievable storms that sometimes kicked up 40-foot waves. And there were times when the boat was literally encrusted with over a foot of ice. They had to use axes and picks to chip it away. They had nothing to eat but seal meat and penguin meat, cooked for the first few days, but raw after their fires stopped working. Can you imagine? And on the last 2 days of their journey, they were struck by a hurricane so violent that, as they later discovered, it actually sank a 500-ton steamer with all crew on board that was sailing in the vicinity. But Shackleton was an unsinkable man. And somehow, with his 20-foot boat, they made it through. After 16 days and 800 miles, they made it to South Georgia Island. They landed on the wrong side of the island. So they had to hike 22 miles to get to the other side, where there was supposed to be a whaling station called Stromness. There was no trail. There was no map. And as far as we know, no man had ever crossed that island before. The terrain was absolutely horrible, with jagged peaks of 8,000 to 10,000 foot elevations, and canyons and crevices thick with snow and ice. And they made it in 36 hours. When they finally came stumbling into that station, let me tell you, man, was there ever a celebration. Sailors and whaling men were absolutely stunned by their arrival, especially when they learned how far they had come. The hike across the island was a miracle in itself, but the boat journey was an absolutely incredible, impossible feat. And for Shackleton's men, it was like they had died and gone to heaven. They had actually been stranded in the Antarctic for 2 years before the 16-day voyage. So you can imagine the celebration. That first night, the men enjoyed hot baths, clean shaves, clean new clothes, a hot meal with meat and canned vegetables. Canned vegetables never tasted so good. And bread and cakes and hot coffee. And coming up after all that, they knew there would be the first warm, dry bed in 2 years. It was an exhilarating moment that none of them would ever forget. Interestingly enough, the one thing they remembered most about that night of celebration was the fact that one of them wasn't celebrating. Shackleton's men have recorded in their journals that before that very first meal was even finished, Shackleton had a map unrolled at the table beside his plate, and he was studying its every detail. Happy? Yes. Relieved? Mm-hmm. But the truth of it was there were 22 men who'd still been left behind on the day he set out on that 16-day trip, stranded on Elephant Island, and Shackleton wasn't about to celebrate until every last one of them had been rescued. And so 3 days after his arrival, his exhausted arrival at that station, Shackleton and 2 of his men turned their backs on the warmth and the comfort and the safety of it all boarded another ship, and sailed right straight back to where they came from. Man, there really has never been anybody quite like Shackleton. Men who have a burden for the lost don't celebrate their victories for long. It's one of the signs of a true leader. And if you ask me, people who have a burden for the lost are the greatest people on earth. Paul was one of those. And perhaps you noticed this morning as we read from the 9th chapter of Romans how quickly the celebration has ceased. It's almost shocking how the tone changes between Romans 8 and Romans 9. Have you noticed? Romans 8 is the most exhilarating chapter in all the Bible. There's no doubt about it. And Christians all love what it says. And I've loved preaching it too. It's all about our victory. It's all about our rescue. It's full of triumph and victory and joy. But in Romans 9, the celebration ends. Paul makes this incredible statement. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. Why is that? Because some have been left behind. Some are still lost. My brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. I'm going to wait until next week to give you a little overview of Romans 9, 10, and 11 because we're launching into new territory here. And I should do it this week, but I'd rather wait. This morning I just want to talk about one thing that comes up in these very first verses, and that is Paul's reaction to those who reject the gospel. It is so relevant to us this morning. I think it is the perfect subject for us as we go into this congregational meeting because we're going to touch upon things this morning that should define the direction and the purpose of our church. And the ultimate question that confronts us this morning is, how do we respond when the world rejects? What is your response when your family and your friends turn against you and ridicule you for your faith? What is your reaction to all that? What is your response when you confront a world that is spiritually and morally in such a terrible state of decline? It's a very important question. And I hope you can examine that question with me this morning from the perspective of your personal Christian life and from the perspective of your church. There's an awful lot to learn from Paul's response, let me tell you. But before we get into Paul's reaction, let me share two other possible reactions. As far as I can tell, there are only three possible responses we can have when we confront a world that rejects the gospel. And only one of them is the right one, and that one's Paul's. The first one is wrong. But let me tell you, it sure is prevalent. And that's anger. And sadly, that is the response of way too many Christians and churches today. And it is so far from the message of the gospel. Over these past few years, we have seen the name of Christ coupled with abortion clinic bombings, angry demonstrations, hateful condemnation, anti-government movements. This last year, some so-called pastor had a group of his followers parading around with signs that said, God hates fags. And sure enough, the media got hold of that, and that's being portrayed as the message of the church. Our message is not denunciation. This is not the age of condemnation. We live in the age of grace, and the message of the church is God's mercy for a world that is lost in sin. We read in John 3:17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned. Listen to the last phrase, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already. That's a very important phrase in that verse. You know what it's saying? It's saying the world's already condemned. We don't need to condemn it. The world has been condemned since the fall of man. And man has been living with the misery of it ever since. I think the church has to be blunt about sin. And homosexuality is a sin. Make no doubt about it. But you know what? So is hatred. No matter how religiously you dress it up. And God will judge them both. And I know there's a time to condemn. I know that's true too. I don't deny that, but let me tell you, you'd better be led by the Spirit of God when you're doing it. And when the church's message is mainly condemnation, the Spirit of God is not there. Christians who are mad at the world are an affront to God. There's no doubt about it. And by the way, kids, some of the Christian rock music you listen to does have this problem. It's angry. It's mad at the world. And you need to be discerning about that. I'm very grateful for a lot of this Christian rock music. It's reaching a lot of kids. But you need to be discerning. There's something wrong with the spirit of it when it's angry like that. And nothing is more fruitless, let me tell you, than a Christian who's mad at the world. Getting mad at the world is like going into prison and telling all the prisoners that they're criminals, for example, or that they're being punished for their crimes. I mean, duh. Tell them something they don't know, or that their circumstances haven't already made abundantly clear to them. Most of the people I talk to in this world already know there's something wrong. They already know, they're already very much aware of the condemnation, or at least of the bondage. Now, there's always exceptions. There's some people who just think that life without God is just great. Deep down inside, you pin them down. They know there's something wrong with life. A few months ago, I got to be on one of the radio talk shows here in the Southland, and the host and I were talking about Christian subjects and taking calls from listeners. It was a lot of fun. And one of the callers jumped all over me right off the bat, and he picked on me because I was a pastor, and he was a Christian. And he said, what I want to know is what you pastors are doing about this gay rights movement that's such a terrible threat to our society. Are you preaching on that or not? And I'm so glad that I could honestly say that I had just written 6 letters to my congressman about those gay rights assembly bills that were going up for a vote. And I'd also mentioned it in the messenger to you people and urged you to write letters too. And I don't do that very often. It was just a blessing that I'd just done it so I could say I did that to him. Because I don't do it enough, I'm sure. But I felt good about that, and I told this young man that. But I also told him this, that as far as my preaching is concerned, and as far as this pulpit is concerned, my message is the cross of Christ and the liberty that it brings, not social reform. I'm not preaching anything but Christ and Him crucified. But what I noticed was the anger in his question. There is no place for anger and condemnation in the Christian's message to the world. If you're going to get angry at the world's unbelief, then the next time you see a blind man crossing the street, roll down your window and get angry at him too. What are you doing out here in the street? You're just stumbling around like that. Can't you see where you're going? What's wrong with you? It's ridiculous. The world is blind. The God of this world has blinded the eyes of those who don't believe. And we read in the Scriptures that the natural man cannot perceive the things of the Spirit. It is only an act of monumental spiritual pride for a man to look down in anger upon someone else who doesn't believe. That's spiritual pride. There is no anger or denunciation or attack in Paul. I see that in these verses. How incredible. As he thinks about the people who have opposed him so, he's not angry. And let me tell you, nobody had more reason to be angry than Paul did about these Jews. He was a Jew, yes, but they'd turned on him. We read in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. That's one of the worst punishments, most humiliating punishments you can have. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, he said. But Paul has no anger. The second response is even more prevalent than the first, I notice. And it's just as wrong, maybe even worse. It's called apathy. Christians who just don't care if the world goes to hell. They'll turn their backs, they'll shake their heads, they'll dismiss the world as hopeless. And by the way, the people who are guilty of this second response, they're usually really happy to hear the preacher preach against the first response. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's right. We shouldn't be so angry. You know what? You don't want to be anything. You don't want to respond to the world in any way if you're apathetic. And that may be worse. I can't tell which one is worse. I'm not sure. But apathy sure is prevalent. How can it be that it doesn't bother us at all when so many people around us are perishing without the truth? We're taking the easy way out, and we just don't care. I'll tell you one thing, it's a sure sign of hypocrisy. Well, I've been going to church all my life, so what's their problem? Let them come. No one's stopping them. That's apathy. That's a heart of apathy. And by the way, if you think you're being saved by going to church all your life, you're one of the unreached. It was apathy in the heart that made the Pharisee ignore the wounded man along the road. And when he saw the man, he crossed over to the other side. And there was apathy in the heart of the elder brother in the story of the prodigal son. Remember him? He is perfectly at ease with the thought that his brother is lost. Man. And when he's found, he can't even rejoice. That's apathy. Apathy in the heart. How can it not trouble you deeply to find yourself in the company of that group? It's difficult to care about a world that is lost, no doubt about it. Apathy is the easier way. Apathy comes in two different ways, I've noticed. Either we don't believe the Scriptures as we claim we do, or we simply believe that the world is hopeless and go our own way. Either way is wrong. We know what the Scriptures say about eternity. We know what the Scriptures say about those who are without God and without hope in the world, but as a matter of fact, our apathy represents a distinct choice not to believe it. We're falling for the age-old lie. They shall not surely die. It's as old as the Garden of Eden. Well, I believe what the Scriptures say. Yeah, I believe that about eternity. I believe the Scriptures, but look at the world. It's hopeless. There's nothing we can do. Listen, as long as God is on the throne, no one is hopeless. Have you been reading what's going on in Jane Fonda's life lately? It was in the Washington Times. She was led to the Lord by her chauffeur, and now he's driving her to his church, a black church in Atlanta. It's awesome. You know, I don't know about you, but I gave up on Jane Fonda a long time ago. And a chauffeur is putting a pastor to shame. It's incredible. See, we get sidetracked. A few years ago, something swept the church called the worship movement, which brought a lot of good things to the church. It made worship good, but there was one philosophy that's not quite right in it, and that was that all we really need to do is worship, and everybody's going to come. And so if we just have good worship, we don't really need to do a lot of outreach. It's just going to draw people in. You know what? Shackleton didn't have that view. He didn't just sit there and celebrate, hoping his men would somehow find a way to get there and join him. That's not enough. Go out into the highways and byways, we're told, and compel them to come in. You see, we get sidetracked by things. Our third response is Paul's response, and it's the only one that counts. It's the only response that Christians should have, and that is anguish. Anguish. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart for the sake of my brothers. No wonder Romans 8 finished so suddenly. Some are still left behind. Some are still lost. Paul's anguish for the lost is the same burden that sent Jesus Christ to the cross in the first place. And you and I should be grieving at the condition of our world. We're supposed to be joyful Christians. Our worship should be beautiful, heartfelt, and joyful. And so I assume we're supposed to have some kind of a balance going on in our lives, that we kind of find ourselves fluctuating between this anguish and the joy that we know we have in Romans 8. Paul had a heart for the lost. And by the way, you will not find a better test of our spiritual condition than this. Concern for the lost, that's the test. That is always the thing that separates the purely theoretical Christian, the purely intellectual Christian, from the real Christian. From those who have a true and living faith, they have a concern for the lost. And talk about a heart for the lost, Paul had it. He actually had an impulse to trade places with the unsaved. That's what we read in verses 2 to 4. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off, verse 3 and 4. For I myself could wish that I were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. And of course, it was an impulse. It was not a legitimate possibility. See, those words could wish in the original, they're a special verb voice called the desiderative voice. And it's a way of expressing something that's very tentative, very timidly expressed, very politely expressed, as if you're afraid to say so directly. And we use that in the English, by the way. If I come to your house and I see that you've got a pie on the table there, and I'm just a guest, I could say to you, I sure could go for a piece of that pie. But you'll notice I didn't say I want the pie. I said I sure could go for that. See, because I know it may not be mine. I may not have that. I may not have any right for that pie. It may not be given to me. And I probably don't have the right to say that. So I put in those nice terms that are kind of timid, you see. That's really what Paul's doing here with this expression. I could almost wish, he says that, see, because he knows it's an impossibility. It just comes to him that his brothers in the Jewish race are going going to perish without Christ. And it gives him so much anguish that the thought comes to mind sometimes, if only I could trade places with them and they could have what I found. You mean you'd take on their lost condition, Paul? Well, I know that can't be done, but sometimes that thought just comes over me. By the way, Paul wasn't the first one to feel that way. Moses actually asked God to let him do that back in Exodus 32:32, when they made the golden gods and worshiped them, and God was angry, and Moses said, this is a great sin, but Lord, if you'll forgive them, you can blot my name out of the book. And God said, that's not going to happen. I'll tell you why it's not going to happen. Because the Son of God himself is going to come someday and become the curse for sin. No man could do that. We read in Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. We couldn't do what Christ did. I had to laugh when I read some of the commentary on this verse. It's incredible how sidetracked these guys get. They love to pick this verse apart, and the intellectuals like to get into it, and they debate all about what Paul meant here and whether or not he was asking for something that could really happen. I could wish myself to be cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers. What does it really mean? How could Paul have a wish like that? And can a Christian really do this sort of thing? And on they go. And of course the answer is no, he can't. But the thing is, if all this verse does is cause us to speculate about things like that, we're really missing the point. Because the question here is not whether or not it's possible to do something like this. The real question is, do I even remotely have a burden for the lost like this? Remotely. I know I don't wish myself to be cursed and cut off from Christ, but can I say that I could wish myself to be inconvenienced for those who don't yet know, for the sake of my brothers, my countrymen? Can I say that I could wish to risk some discomfort? Risk my finances some? Risk some embarrassment for the sake of the lost? Could I say that much at least? Kids, can you say that you could wish yourself to be cursed by your friends? And the popular crowd at school, be cut off from them for the sake of your brothers and sisters at school? Can you say that you could wish to serve? Could you say that you could wish to give for that purpose? God will be pleased if we even get close to what Paul did. An awesome person. God expects his children to share his burden for the lost. And here's what our church needs. We need members who are committed and sacrificial with a true heart for the lost. And let me say this to those of you who have been grieving over the moral and spiritual condition of our country. Welcome to the club. The anguish you feel puts you in great company. You're with Paul. All you need to do is put that anguish to work the way he did. And when you give and serve and encourage in this church, you are helping to reach the lost. I hope you know that. That is exactly what God wants of you. Start serving. Simplify your lifestyle so that you can give more faithfully. Drive your car a few more years. Keep the old furniture a few years longer. Simplify your lifestyle so that you can serve and give more. And leaders, we need leaders who are devoted to the word of truth. It's the only message that will make a difference. That's why our choice of leaders is so important, which we're going to be doing in this next meeting. We're going to be choosing men and women who are committed not just to the business of church, but to the Word of God and the faithfulness of its message. And finally, we need a mission. We need a mission to preach the message far away and close to home. And you know what I notice about Paul in these verses? He has a burden for the entire world, not just one part of it. Think about that. Here is Paul, who was a Jew himself, who was rejected by his own people, and who became the apostle to the Gentiles. That in itself is an incredible thing. He was a proud, intense Jew. But now look at him. Now his burden is for the Greek and the Turk and the Arab and the Roman. Man, that's awesome. But we also see in these verses we just read, he still has a deep burden for the Jew. Paul was a committed Christian, and he was committed to missions both at home and abroad, far and near. And that is a real Christian. Be careful how you view the world. A wise Christian knows that he cannot afford to put home and abroad in two different spheres. And I often encounter Christians who make this mistake. They either have no burden for missions whatsoever, missions overseas, or they have no burden but missions overseas. And in either case, they're wrong, and they're very far from Paul. As far as the Great Commission is concerned, home and abroad are the same world. There are not two spheres. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world," and the last time I checked it out, the world was one sphere, not two. I'm astounded to hear Christians say, well, you know what, I think we should be spending our mission money here at home in America, not some country far away we don't know anything about. You know, that person is miles away from the purposes of God. Go ye into all the world, we're told. But then the other extreme is just as bad. I don't give my money to churches. I just give to missions, as if that were somehow much more spiritual. You know, missionaries overseas struggling in the bush, and you guys over here spending money in some fancy classroom or the sanctuary, you know. You know what the missionary does with the money you send over to him? He spends it on a classroom. That's what he does. I know, because I was one. I spent your money on the sanctuary over there, fixing it up so it looked nice for the people over there. I can tell you, it's exactly what happens. I had to laugh when I talked to Mr. Christodos, our dear Indian friend who runs that very Spartan little missionary way out in the remote parts of eastern India. When I asked him what he wanted us to do to help him, he said, we need computers. And we'd like to have a modem if we could so we could get on the internet and email you guys. I thought he was going to say pith helmets or machetes or something, you know. Most of the churches right here in America are on the frontiers of the gospel here. Most of the churches here in America are on the frontiers of the gospel here. I know this church is. Half of the kids who join us on Friday in Dave's group don't yet know the Lord. And last Friday, several of them gave their lives to Christ. Just 2 days ago, Dave told me about it last night. College kids have been coming to Christ in Jeff Solomeyer's group this year. And we've had people come to Christ in our new members class last year, and others in our small group fellowships. And last Friday, we laid to rest a little 9-year-old girl who is now in heaven because our Sunday school teacher, Peggy Bohr, led her to pray to receive Jesus Christ as her Savior. Don't tell me you don't support churches here. Please don't do that. One of my favorite chapters in all of American literature is a little obscure journal called The Diary of Nathan Cole. It was written in the 1740s, and one entry is really something. In it, Nathan Cole describes the arrival of an evangelist to his town. I've read this before. I hope I can read it this time without weeping. The great evangelist George Whitefield, whose preaching brought a great revival to America in the 1740s, and he was coming to this man's town, and he wrote about it. Listen to it, and remember as I'm reading that we're talking about your country, America. About this time it pleased God to send Mr. Whitefield into this land. I heard first that he had come to Philadelphia and that thousands had come to hear him preach. Next I heard he was on Long Island. Next at Boston, and next at Northampton. And then one morning, all of a sudden, about 8 or 9 o'clock, there came a messenger and said, Mr. Whitefield is to preach at Middletown this morning at 10 o'clock. I was in my field at work, and I dropped the tool that I had in my hand and ran home, and ran through my house and told my wife to get ready, quick, to go and hear Mr. Whitefield preach at Middleton. And I ran to my pasture for my horse with all my might, fearing that I should be too late to hear him. I brought my horse home and soon mounted and took my wife up behind me, and together we went forward as fast as I thought the horse could bear. And when my horse began to be out of breath, I got down and put my wife in the saddle and bid her ride as fast as she could, and not to stop or to slack for me unless I told her so, and so I would run alongside until I was almost out of breath, and then mount my horse again. And so I did several times to favor my horse, for we had 12 miles to ride double in little more than an hour. On high ground I saw before me a cloud, or was it a fog, I first thought, off the great river. But as I came nearer the road, I heard a noise, something like the low rumbling of horses' hooves coming down the road. And this cloud was the cloud of dust made by the running of horses' feet. It arose several rods into the air, over the tops of the hills and the trees. And when I came within about 20 rods of the road, I could see men and horses slipping along in the cloud like shadows. And when I came nearer, it was like a steady stream of horses and riders. Scarcely a horse more than one length behind the other, and all of them a lather, some of them with sweat. We went down with the stream. I heard no man speak a word all the way, 3 miles. But everyone was pressing forward in great haste. And when we got down to the old meeting house, there was a great multitude. It was said to be 3,000 or 4,000 people assembled together. We got off our horses and shook off the dust, and I turned and looked toward the great river and saw ferry boats running swift, forward and backward, bringing over loads of people, the oars rowing nimbly and quick. Everything, men, horses, and boats, all seemed to be struggling for life. And the land, the banks of the river, looked black with people and horses. And all along the 12 miles I had traveled, I had not seen one man at work in his field. All of them had come. Father in heaven, we just want to humble ourselves before you today at the magnitude of the task. This is our country. Emma, would you pray for me? Just pray.
Shall we bow our heads in prayer? Our Heavenly Father, we heard the message of Paul, who often took a respite away from his mission, but went back, put a shoulder to the wheel, and kept on. And we pray that this congregation can also continue to have faith and show by our actions that we believe in Almighty God. Now, Lord, we pray that as we continue our life throughout the week, we may remember this message and apply it so that others may follow us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.